You're watching Sitka Community TV. Be sure to like and subscribe if you like what you see.
Having watched my friends all try to find housing.
Should we give it 3 more minutes?
Well, why don't you just talk?
Yeah.
Say something exciting.
You need to tell a joke now.
Yeah, joke. A joke, Gary. I don't know any jokes. I would be really stumped. Ooh, that check thing might be able to help.
What did the left eye say to the right eye? Between me and you, something smells.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
I wish I could get it.
What happened when the red ship crashed into the blue ship?
Because of the light. I see.
They were marooned.
You just spend your evenings memorizing jokes.
All right, maybe I should start instead. So, welcome. Good afternoon. I'm Gary White. I'm the Executive Director of the Sitka Economic Development Association. Welcome to the presentation on the state of the Sitka economy. Thank you for spending some time this afternoon on this sunny day to learn more about our local economy and the past trends where we have been, which will hopefully help us to understand where we are going in the future. Our local economy, as most of you know, is heavily influenced by fishing, tourism, and government employment. However, like many other regions around the world, Sitka has faced a number of challenges in recent years that have impacted its economic stability and growth. In this presentation, we'll explore the current state of the Sitka economy, including its strengths and weaknesses. And of course, we at CETA are dedicated to helping improve the local economy and therein the overall quality of life for all Sitkans. We hope this presentation will provide you with some valuable insights for those interested in economic development in Sitka and the surrounding regions. And I'd like to introduce Taylor Holman with the McKinley Research Group, who will be presenting the data this afternoon. And please hold on to your questions. At the end, we will have a question and answer period. And thank you for coming. And then I'll just throw out, there's a trends newsletter sign up on the back. CETA quarterly puts out a little mini trends that shows where all of our data is. And we can happily email that to you if you put your name and email on there. So I'll turn it over to Taylor here.
Hi everyone, as Gary mentioned, my name is Taylor Holman and I'm an economist with McKinley Research Group. I'm here today to present the state of Sitka's economy. McKinley Research Group has worked with CETA for many years, crunching the numbers to provide you with the most updated demographic and socioeconomic data available. I've worked on this project for the last few iterations now, and I'm very excited to travel to your beautiful, walkable community to present the data to you this year. Now, some of you may be familiar with McKinley Research Group under our former name, McDowell Group. Last year, we celebrated 50 years of research and consulting in Alaska, with services including economic analyses, community economic planning, business development, survey research, among many others. We have offices in both Juneau and Anchorage. Like I said, I'm an economist with McKinley Research and have worked there since 2021. I primarily work on economic analyses and analyze demographic, socioeconomic, housing data for communities throughout the state. I'm a lifelong Alaskan, born and raised in Unalaska, and have lived in around every corner of the state, including Anchorage, Fairbanks, and a recent move to Juneau at the start of this year. So the information I will share today will be in 4 primary categories: population, labor force and employment data, a spotlight on a couple key industries, including seafood and tourism, and then finally a housing section. Now, the first of many caveats is that although I may be well versed in the numbers, you certainly are much more well versed about your community itself than I am. I already outed myself as a pretty recent Southeast transplant, and I am by no means the expert in all things Sitka. What I'm bringing today is a look into the data behind what's happening in your community, and a perspective from my work researching the overall Alaska economy. I'm hoping that this discussion will ultimately spark a conversation with you about the direction of your economy. So the first section I'll talk about today is population. This is the foundation of all other indicators I'll talk about today. It might not be as juicy as housing or employment, but all things are impacted by and in part dependent on Sitka's resident population. So let's take a look at what's happened throughout the last 30 years. Between 1992 and 2022, Sitka's max population happened in 1993 at just over 9,000 people. In 2022, the most recent year of data available, this was the minimum population in the last 30 years at 8,350. A big takeaway here is that Sitka's population was pretty darn stable until around 2012. Of the 8% decline in the past 30 years, 7% has occurred in the last 10 years and 3% in the last 5 years. Now let's dive a bit deeper into what's driving this decline. One contributor to changing in population is net migration. Net migration is the difference between the people that are moving to Sitka and the people that are leaving each year. You'll see in the blue bars show net immigration for a year, and in the red bars, which there are many more of, are net out-migration. In the last 10 years, there have been almost 900 people leaving Sitka. Now, this net migration is based on PFD applications to establish residency and doesn't capture the non-resident worker populations. But because it is based on PFDs, we do know where people are going when they leave Sitka. 3 out of 4 net out migrants in the last 5 years moved out of state. Other top in-state destinations include people moving to Juneau, 7%, and people moving to Anchorage, 6%. Out-migration contributes the most to Sitka's population decline. The other contributor to a change in population is natural increase. Natural increase is the number of births in a year, shown in the blue bars, minus the number of deaths, shown in the orange bars. The net natural increase is the blue line that goes throughout those bars. You'll see that natural increase has slowed over the last decade. Now this is in part due to a lower number of births per year. In the prior 10 years, from 2002 to 2012, there was 119 births per year on average. Now there's around 85 births per year. So you're seeing this lower amount of births, and a lot of that has to do with the smaller working age population, which I'll go into more in the next slide. There's also been a slight increase in deaths recently, likely related to the Pioneer Home in Sitka, which has played a role. In terms of birth rates, Sitka is higher than neighboring boroughs in Southeast, higher than Juneau and Ketchikan, but lower than the Alaska statewide birth rate. So let's go into how population has changed by age cohort over the last 10 years. 2013 is shown on the left, and 2022 is shown on the right, and these graphs are divided into 3 age cohorts. First in blue is the number of children in Sitka, residents 0 to 19. Then the gold orange chunk is the working age population, also the population between 20 and 64, which is what economists like to call working age, but we all know people work far beyond age 64. But for these purposes, we're going to call it working age population. Then at the top, you have the number of residents above 65. Although the overall population decline has been 7% over the last decade, the population over 65 has actually increased by 34%. It's a pretty stark difference. Meanwhile, the working age population fell by around 700 people, 13%, which drives a decline in the number of children. As I mentioned in the last slide, it's correlated with a smaller population of people having babies. So dovetailing on that discussion of aging population and working age population, let's discuss labor force and employment in Sitka. This slide shows the resident labor force over the past 10 years, with everyone who's a resident and employed in Sitka shown in blue, then a little sliver of people at the top who are unemployed and looking for work. Those two numbers together equal that top data label, which is the total resident labor force each year. Now, in 2022, you had the lowest annual unemployment rate on record. That's from around 1980 when this data started to be collected. Since the pandemic, there's been a complete recovery of the resident labor force. You'll see this labor force number in the 2022 bar is around what it was in 2015. But you'll notice that that might be somewhat inconsistent with what I was telling you in the previous slide with the declining working age population. How can the working age population decrease, but the labor force increase? Well, there might be more people who are actually wanting to work. This labor force does not include people who are unemployed and not looking for work. But this data is also based on a national model and survey sampling. So there's generally a margin of error associated, and the changes we're seeing over the past few years may be just within the margin of error. But in general, as the population continues to age, we would expect to see this labor force decline and an increased potential for adding more non-resident or non-local Alaskan workers to Sitka's workforce. So let's take a look at the residency of all workers in Sitka. This is of Sitka's total workforce, divided by the percent that's local residents, non-local residents, which are people who live elsewhere in Alaska and are Alaskan residents but working in Sitka, and then you have your non-residents who are not Alaskan residents. You notice that Sitka has a lower percentage of resident workforce than other boroughs in Southeast and Alaska overall. This is due to the role of non-residents in seafood processing and in the dessert industry. However, you'll also see on the text box on the, the right, Sitka's local resident percentage over time has decreased. In 2011, that local resident percent of the total workforce was 67%, and then in the last 4 of the most recent 5 years, it varied between 60 and 62%, and had a 5% drop from 2020 to 2021, now at 57%. This has been seen throughout the state. Juneau and Ketchikan's resident workforce population both declined by 9% within the last year, and the overall Alaska resident workforce population decreased by 5%. Now, coupled with that data on the local resident labor force we saw on the previous slide, it makes sense that more businesses in Sitka are looking elsewhere for employees. They're hiring non-local residents or non-residents because that unemployment rate is so low. If people want to be employed in Sitka, most all of them already are. So next I'll walk through some wage and salary employment data. This is shown by month because of the seasonality of employment in Sitka. And this wage and salary employment does not include anyone who's self-employed, like commercial fishermen, and doesn't include any uniformed military personnel like the Coast Guard. So a key takeaway here, looking at the difference between 2019, which is that dark blue line, and 2022, which is that light blue line, is that the monthly employment in 2022 has shown significant recovery and is just below those 2019 levels. I've calculated the averages based on 9-month trends because the most recent data available for this data set is September of 2022. It's important to calculate them, the 2019 data also based on that 9-month average, because otherwise it'll be artificially lower because of the low employment rates in the last quarter of the year. If you look at the 9 months of data in 2022 versus the 12 months in 2019, 2019's would appear lower because you're adding in those lower employment months in the end of the year. So all that being said, based on those 9-month averages, you're seeing a decrease of only 3% employment from 2019, which is around 156 jobs. So although a complete recovery of wage and salary employment has not quite been achieved, the trajectory is certainly in the right direction. Now, here's another way to look at how wage and salary employment has recovered since the pandemic. This graph is in terms of percentages based on 2019 employment being 100%. If the bars reach 100%, that's 100% recovery to 2019 levels. You'll see that in all 3 Southeast boroughs that are listed, Juneau, Ketchikan, and Sitka, there's been a bigger drop in 2020 in those boroughs than there was in Alaska. The drop is shown in that gold bar, which shows 2020 employment as a percentage of 2019 employment. Sitka's employment dropped 15% in 2020. Since then, it has recovered by 12%, gaining 9% back in 2021, an additional 3% in 2022. like I mentioned before, you're now 3% below full recovery, which is on par with statewide rates. As for Juneau and Ketchikan, they decreased by a similar amount but have not achieved the level of recovery that Sitka has. You'll also see, which is interesting, that Sitka gained most of its employment back in 2021, where other Southeast boroughs gained most of their employment back in 2022. So it achieved faster recovery than other Southeast boroughs and has achieved a more complete recovery than other Southeast boroughs. So this is a slide kind of packed with information, but I'll just give you a few key points off of this. This is based on subsector or selected sector employment, wage and salary employment. Again, this is the 9-month average of jobs between January and September. 2019 is highlighted in yellow on the far left side of the graph, 2022 on the far right, and you have a couple selected percentage changes in the middle. So first, scenic and sightseeing transportation saw a much larger loss between 2019 and 2020 than overall employment in Sitka did, understandably. They're in the visitor industry, as did accommodations and eating and drinking places. However, eating and drinking places is now actually above 2019 employment, with 364 employees in this sector versus 342 in 2019. Seafood processing is also above 2019 employment, as is construction and retail trade. Scenic and sightseeing transportation is still 33% below 2019 employment, accommodations are 10% below, and state government is 3% below. Now, before I move on to the next section, I can't help but take a little look at average wages in Sitka. So all of these are inflation-adjusted average wages, so they're in terms of 2022 dollars. So as of 2022, Sitka average wages were 13% below Alaska average wages. And this is largely due to the prevalence of seasonal jobs in Sitka and kind of the nature of that work, which is in large part, they pay lower wages than other jobs. So everyone in this room is well aware that inflation has risen rapidly over the next few years. So when adjusting for inflation, wages have actually decreased. The highest inflation-adjusted wage was in 2020 in Sitka at $58,300 a year, and since then has decreased by 5% in inflation-adjusted terms. As economists love to say, wages are sticky. Now, this is not the sticky wages where you spill syrup on your paycheck. This is the kind of sticky wages where on that paycheck, the dollar amount has stayed the same, but the buying power is changing due to inflation. Let's say for ease of math purposes, you get $100,000 a year on your paycheck. If inflation is 8%, that dollar amount on the paycheck doesn't increase to $108,000 next year. It stays the same. It's kind of stuck in place, even though inflation is increasing and decreasing the buying power of those dollars. Now, let's take a look at just how much inflation has increased over the past couple years. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out a CPI, which is a consumer price index. This is an index of a number of goods, which they call a basket of goods. This shows the price of things like meat and eggs and gas and utilities, all lumped together into this index, which changes over time based on how much those things cost. There's one for the US as a whole, shown in yellow. The percent changes on here are the year-over-year percent changes. And in blue, you have one for Alaska. Now this is based on urban Alaska, which is a combination of prices in Anchorage and the Mat-Su, which, as you all know, prices are much higher here than they are in Anchorage and the Mat-Su. So while it's not the best fit for Sitka, it at least reflects some of those transportation costs and the added cost of living and doing business in Alaska. So the deflation we're seeing in 2020, if you can remember that far back, is due to the low oil prices we saw at the start of the pandemic, due in part to that at least. Since then, we saw 4 to 5% inflation in 2021 and 8% in 2022, which is the highest inflation since the 1980s. This will have major impacts on what we all can afford and how far investors and governments can stretch their capital dollars. Now, a slight silver lining to all of this is that as of February 2023, the most recent data available, annual inflation was 6% for the US and 4.3% for the Alaska metric. So we're still gaining 4.3% over last year, but it's a slower rate of change than it was last year at the very least. So now I'm going to go into some recent trends across a few key sectors in Sitka. The first of which is the seafood industry. So the graph here shows the estimated value in millions and pounds, also in millions, from 2012 to 2021 of all seafood that's caught and brought to shore in Sitka. The big story here is how much 2021 pounds in value have recovered since 2020 lows. 2020, we saw a pretty steep drop due to the lower demand and prices for some high-value species, including salmon, halibut, and sablefish. Prices and demand have since recovered for those species, and you're seeing a 120% increase from 2020 value, and the third highest total value in the past decade. Compared to the prior 5-year average between 2016 and 2020, 2021 values are 72% higher. Now this is kind of stale data. 2021 was a pretty long time ago. This is the most recent we have. As of 2021, there were 373 active permit holders, a handful more than 2020, which is also, the small additions to that are also related to the recovery of demand and prices for those high-value species. So another indicator for the seafood industry is seafood processing employment. This also, like my graph earlier, has the monthly changes in employment between 2019 in the dark blue bar and 2022 in the light blue bar. Big story here is that although 2022 9-month average employment was above 2019 levels, it was slightly below 2021. 2021, as I showed on the last slide, was kind of a banner year. And although we are seeing a 12% decrease from 2021 employment, it's still quite a bit above 2019 employment, which is great. We'll turn now to the visitor industry. I know the community has been well aware of the swift recovery in the number of cruise passengers and port calls visiting Sitka. I'm here to tell you that the expectations for 2023, based on ship capacity and port calls, are even higher than 2022. In 2022, you saw 279 port calls to Sitka, bringing over 380,000 passengers. Now, those actuals came in 17% below expected volumes because although ships have a capacity of, say, like 10,000 passengers, 17% less rooms were actually booked than they have capacity for. So that 2023 forecast showing just above 500,000 passengers will likely maybe come in lower, but if capacity is at 100%, you're going to see around 550,000 passengers, which is 40% more passengers than in 2022, and 155% more than 2019. There's also going to be 29 more ships in 2023 than there were in 2022. Now, I don't think I have to tell anyone in this room what kind of pressure this puts on your community and services, but there's a lot of upside. While we don't have current data on average spending, say each of these visitors spent $100. They went to the Highliner and got coffee, went and bought a pair of earrings, maybe went to the Mean Clean. That was just my day, but let's say I spent about $100. That would be about $56 million in spending. That could have real sales tax and economic implications for your community. So this is another visitor industry indicator, which is air passenger traffic. Air passenger traffic was just 5% below 2019 levels in 2022, based on averages from January through September. You'll see that in 2019, which is shown in dark blue, versus 2022, which is shown in light blue, the months that really lagged were January through April, but in the summer months, if you get out your binoculars, 2022 was actually slightly above 2019 in both June and September. So it's achieved pretty full recovery for summer 2022 traffic, although in the winter months it wasn't quite there. Now the final visitor industry indicator I'll show you is ferry traffic, which is one that has not seen significant recovery after the pandemic. As of 2022, passenger volumes were 59% below 2019. Although there has been a 55% increase in passenger volumes compared to 2020. 2021. So 55% over the last year, but due to limited sailings, you're still quite a bit below pre-pandemic levels. Now, before I move into my last section, I don't want to neglect a couple other key sectors, the first being healthcare. Healthcare and social assistance employment averaged 760 jobs between January and September of 2022. This is an increase from 2019, but this is largely due to the sale of sale of the hospital to Search, which reclassified all of those employees as healthcare employees rather than local government employees. You'll likely see another bump up as the Search Hospital completes construction towards 2025. As for the Coast Guard, of course, has a significant presence and impact in the community. Data on military employment is one that has a bit of a lag, but as of 2021, there's around 250 uniformed military personnel in Sitka, which is virtually no change from 2019 or 2020. This is a very stable form of employment. Finally, I'm going to round out today's presentation with a spotlight on housing, which is a key point of interest in Sitka, throughout the state, and a pretty hot topic of conversation. But before I can, I have to do my due diligence and highlight a few caveats and mention some significant limitations in housing data, which, to put it bluntly, can kind of suck. Due to small sample sizes, it can be really unreliable, and a lot of them are based on surveys. So first off, we have the United States Census Bureau's American Community Survey. These are, as the name suggests, surveys, and it has a very high margin of error. These are done in April of each year, so your vacancy rates can look a little higher because it's conducted in April versus in the summer months where those vacancy rates would be lower. And also they're based on 5-year averages. The only 1-year American Community Survey data is on the statewide level. You don't get that 1-year look at a community like Sitka or anything smaller than a state. So because of those 5-year averages, you can't look at the change over time in short periods. And your 2021 numbers will have 2020 wrapped into those averages, which is another kind of weird thing about this data set. So next is the Housing Finance Corporation, the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, AHFC, which is also based on surveys and also can have a margin of error. There's also a pretty limited data availability by borough. So for some of AHFC's data, they survey 10 boroughs for some metrics, and only 8 for others. Sitka is one of the lucky 10, so I have some HFC data to present, but it is not one of the lucky 8, so I'm pretty limited in this data set. Now for multiple listing service data. This data captures stuff that's put on the market and shows things like average price for housing put on the market, the days that they're on the market, the number of active listings. It's a great data set for somewhere like Anchorage or the Mat-Su. But for Sitka, I know firsthand that in a small community, when someone's moving, everyone in town knows about it, and everyone in town has made an offer on this house well before they started packing their things, let alone thought about putting it on the market. So because very few houses are put on the market in Sitka, there's a very small sample size for multiple listing service data, and the data is pretty easily skewed. Now finally, a pretty new data set that I'm excited to talk about is AirDNA data. This is data on short-term rentals. These are your Airbnbs, your VRBOs. Now, they don't include data from other platforms like Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, but the majority of the market for short-term rentals are through Airbnb or VRBO, so you get a pretty good look into short-term rental data. Now that I've told you why a lot of these data sets are not good to use, let's look at the data behind it. So first, as a primer, this slide shows an overview of all housing units in Sitka. This data is from the Census Bureau American Community Surveys, which, as I mentioned earlier, has a high margin of error and is based on April surveys. You'll see, for example, those vacancy rates, 15 or 17%, doesn't seem right. Well, that's based on April data, and there's a number of things that go into vacancy that I'll get into in a later slide that may ramp up those numbers from what's actually available to rent or buy. So this data suggests that 15% of units in 2017 were vacant, and 17% in 2021 were vacant. While this may look like a slight increase based on the published numbers, let's take a look at those margins of errors, plus or minus 3% in 2017. This means that anywhere from 12% to 18% of units could have reasonably been held vacant that year, and in 2021 that number is anywhere from 14 to 20%. So it looks like there's a slight increase, but it's within the margin of error, so we can't say for certain whether there's been any change over the last 5 years. It's not statistically significant. The only data that is kind of sort of just on the edge of being outside of the margins of error are the percent of occupied units that are owner-occupied versus renter-occupied. The data shows that in 2021, slightly more units were owner-occupied than they were in 2017, and slightly fewer occupied units were renter-occupied. Now, as promised, let's take a closer look at that vacancy data to see why exactly those units are being held vacant and why those rates are so high. Again, this has a very high margin of error. It's done in April. Please take this with a grain of salt. The data suggests a slight increase in the number of vacant units. You'll see 608 vacant units in 2017 in the yellow bars, in the data label of the yellow bars, 608, versus 704 in 2021. But as I showed in the previous slide, that's within the margin of error, unfortunately. Of all of the vacancies shown on this graph, vacancies for seasonal use, for rent, rented units that aren't currently occupied when the census is going and surveying them, units that are for sale, units that are sold but not occupied when the census is going and surveying, and there's all other vacancies, which is everything from people are out on vacation, or they're holding their house vacant while they're doing repairs, or it's being foreclosed, kind of just lumped all into that other vacancies metric. The only three that have changes outside of the margin of error are the number of units for sale, which is a decrease of 86% within 2017 to 2021 data. The number of units for rent, which is that second one down, which is an increase of 73%, plus 32 units. And finally, the number of units that are for seasonal use, which is an addition of 57%. That seasonal use piece is on your short-term rentals. They're your units that are held vacant, used for seasonal employees. So as of April of 2021, it was estimated by the Census Bureau that approximately 291 units were held vacant. Again, plus or minus a bunch of units. So here's a look into that short-term rental data based on that AirDNA database. This is shown by quarter. Quarter 1 shown in dark blue to quarter 4 shown in light blue from 2018 to 2023, with the average number of active listings each year shown above in the gray boxes. Now you'll see that you had a slight drop-off due to COVID in 2020 that didn't really recover yet in 2021, but had a rapid increase in 2022. An average of 93 units were actively listed on Airbnb or VRBO all year last year. And in 2023, you have 87 units that were listed actively on Airbnb and VRBO just in quarter 1. That's just from January to March, which is the highest number of active listings of any of the first quarters, and higher than any on any quarter in 2021 or 2020. It's pretty incredible. Now, you may be wondering, if you're like me and you're going into town, you're thinking, oh, should I rent a hotel? Should I rent an Airbnb? What are the average prices between the two? Now, in 2022, the average price of an Airbnb unit, which, keep in mind, includes everything from a separate bedroom that you have maybe like a common space kitchen that you're sharing with the owner, and a bathroom that you're sharing with the owner, all the way to the lighthouse, which is on Airbnb, which is, I think, around $1,000 a night is what I heard. But everywhere in between is capturing that number. On average, those prices were $267 a night, including those cleaning fees. Now that's a 27% increase from 2018, and 18% higher than nightly hotel rates from the Westmark and the Aspen. Now let's move into long-term rentals. This means any rentals that include monthly costs instead of daily costs, and may or may not involve a lease, but let's focus on the monthly versus daily rates. So this graph shows the adjusted monthly rate of a rental unit in Sitka and in Alaska, in yellow. Adjusted rent, this is not adjusted for inflation. This is your contract rent, which is the dollar amount that is posted on the ad that you responded to, or the friend that told you about their unit being rented, plus any other costs a renter may incur, which is electricity, or gas, or snow removal, or trash removal, anything else that you're going to have to pay as a renter of that property. The adjusted rental rates in Sitka have been the highest of any of those 10 surveyed boroughs for the past 3 years. Now, they're actually lower than Alaska averages from 2013 to 2016, but have since risen above and have now taken the first place spot in terms of how high they are. In 10-year terms adjusted for inflation, Sitka rents are $30 higher than they were now versus 2013. So although it looks like it's increased a lot in adjusted terms, in terms of inflation, it's actually only increased by like $30. However, Alaska, those rental rates have been sticky and are $75 below the inflation adjusted rent that it was in 2013. So in talking about housing costs, it's also important to talk about how affordable these rates are to your residents. This slide contains data from the U.S. Census Bureau, and that's why you have these really high margins of error, and please take these with a grain of salt. So this graph shows the percent of all owners or renters, owners on the left, renters on the right, that are cost burdened. The definition of cost burden is an individual that spends more than 30% of their net income on housing costs. Now, it's unsurprising that there are more cost-burdened renters than owners, both in Alaska and in Sitka, because of the fact that renters typically have lower household income. The rate of cost-burdened owners, when you're looking at the published numbers for Sitka, are on par with Alaska, both at 22%. But accounting for that margin of error, which is a whopping 10%, you're seeing anywhere from 12% of owners being cost-burdened all the way up to 32%. Which is above and below the margin of error range for Alaska. So if we throw that out, that doesn't mean anything. As for renters, it may appear that there are more renters in Sitka that are cost burdened than in Alaska, but again, if you thought 10% margin of error was high, look at 21%. That means anywhere from 28% of renters are cost burdened, and anywhere up to 70%. So that's a high enough margin of error for that statistic to mean very little. Although it is important to talk about affordability, we can't say with any certainty how affordable housing is in Sitka based on this data set. So finally, let's take a look at the number of new housing units added in Sitka over the last decade. This is data from AHFC. In 2022, you'll see single-family units in the gold were the highest number of added single-family units in 2022 than anywhere in the last decade. So a single-family unit is defined by AHFC as either a single-family home or a mother-in-law apartment or additional unit that's been attached to a single-family home. So there are 30 single-family units built in 2022. There's a slight decrease in the number of multifamily units this year, but that's mainly due to the surge of them that were built in 2020 and 2021. These last 3 years of data are the highest, well, except for 2015, which is on par with 2020, the highest number of new units built in the last decade. So I just threw a tsunami of information at you and a tsunami of numbers. There won't be a quiz. There will only be 4 key takeaways that I hope that you'll remember. I'll be thrilled if you can remember even 2 of them. So first off, way back to that population piece. There's been a declining population in Sitka, and there's been a continued trend of an aging population and a continued trend of net out migration. Second, wage and salary employment has recovered nearly in full since pre-pandemic levels, which is in line with Alaska recovery currently only 3% below 2019. As for key sectors, the seafood industry, in terms of value and pounds, have rebounded after 2020 lows. And as for the visitor industry, arrivals will continue to increase in 2023 and boomed in 2022 and are likely going to see further increases this summer. Finally, for that housing piece, the housing market is tight, costs are high, and there are many more short-term rentals now than there were 5 years ago or even last year. However, as I've drilled in throughout that housing piece, secondary data, which is data that's collected through public or by request versus data that I'm going out and collecting myself, making those phone calls, it can be poor and unreliable for small communities because of the large margins of error and the limited data availability. Often the best way of looking at housing data in small communities is by that primary research, by going out and calling people, surveying it yourself. A community survey allows the opportunity to gather and analyze this primary data, which has a smaller margin of error because of the larger sample size, and allows for a more targeted survey with questions that you and your community want to know about housing. So in conclusion, thank you for spending this beautiful sunny afternoon with me looking at graphs. I hope this presentation has provided you with a better understanding of the economic landscape in Sitka and the challenges and opportunities facing the community. But now I'd like to open the floor to questions. In the back.
I got a mic here for you.
I couldn't hear what you said. Hi. So, one, I'd like to get a copy of this. Is this possible?
Sure, it'll be available on CETA's website. We'll be publishing it. Mm-hmm.
Two, don't really like the way the Department of Labor defines employment in industry, because I think they say that if you have to work 2 quarters out of the year before you count it. So you leave out the fishing industry. So seafood processing is only a small part of the fishing industry in Sitka.
Right.
And only a small part of the employment. I also noticed that you had, in one of the last slides, 0 new mobile homes. And it strikes me, I've never lived in a mobile home, but it strikes me that a mobile home is affordable housing. And the city of Sitka should try to figure out some way of developing a trailer park in this town that maybe they own, because they do have land, and it's the most affordable way to get into a dwelling. And finally, I only heard you mention, didn't see a slide, of sales tax. And I wanted to point out, I'm a commercial fisherman, kind of winding down commercial fisherman, but last year, 2022, the price of fuel was double roughly what it was the year before. And we pay in the summer the 6% sales tax on that fuel. So even if it was just the same amount of fuel bought, the sales tax from the fuel and oil and everything else was double to the fishermen last year over the year before. And I think that when economic interests start crunching the numbers on sales tax, they leave out the fishing industry entirely. And so that record sales tax last year, a sizable hunk of it, I don't know how much, was from the really expensive all-time record cost of fuel to go fishing. And thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, as for that sales tax piece, I don't believe the City and Borough of Sitka publish a breakout of what the sales taxes collect by, like fuel versus retail sales, but that would be a key point of interest for future conversations. And as for that Department of Labor piece, you're right that commercial fishermen and other self-employed people aren't included in those numbers. So that wage and salary employment is actually lower than Sitka's total employment due to the big influx of commercial fishermen that you're seeing in the summer, as well as all those uniform Coast Guard personnel. So those wage and salary employment, although it's interesting to look at, people who are getting wages through like a salary employment job, it's not capturing that full employment number. Sure.
How about individuals looking for jobs? Do we have a number on that compared to jobs available?
That's that unemployment rate. So an unemployment rate includes anyone who's unemployed but looking for a job. And that was the lowest percentage it has been since 1980. Therefore, there's a very small proportion of people who want a job that don't have a job.
I see that in the past decade, population's been pretty steadily declining, and housing construction has been in fits and starts going pretty steadily up. So do you have any insights into what's going on there?
Well, there's a big need for housing in Sitka, as there is throughout the state. Housing is, as I said, a hot topic of conversation because of the limited housing availability in communities. And you're getting the search hospital built, and there's going to be an influx in employees that are going to need housing from there. So that increase in housing is due less to the decreased need because of the decreasing population. You're still having that big influx of employment in the summer months that's not captured in that total employment or total population number. So really the seasonal population is much higher than that 8350 number that it was in 2022 for just residents of Sitka. So you still have that housing need in the summer, even if the population is declining.
Good afternoon, and thank you for that presentation. Though I have many questions, the question I will stick with is, you noted that resident employment is down. Would the reason for that, or can that be ascribed to seasonalization of our community? Meaning that we are developing for example, a summer workforce, but will eventually affect who is left here in the winter.
That is a good point. And in a lot of communities that have this seasonal influx in employment, they're not able to only employ residents in the summer. They have an additional need on top of the residents that are ready and able to work. But it's not only in seasonal places with seasonal jobs and the seasonality that we're seeing like in the visitor industry or seafood industry. Alaska as a whole is also seeing that decline in resident employment. And so it's also due to that low unemployment number in Sitka and throughout the state, and frankly nationwide. There's just more people that want people to work for them, and the resident employment or the resident workforce just isn't able to meet that need. And that's not only in communities with seasonal, really seasonal workforces, it's throughout the state and throughout the nation. It is a good question, and I don't know what the answer is for it. Yeah, what the solution is.
Just drilling into the population changes in terms of proportions in different age ranges, did you have an opportunity to dig into sort of the causation on that? Is it that we are experiencing disproportionate out-migration of young adults and children, and so the remaining population is disproportionately older? Are we seeing in-migration disproportionately in the 65-plus age group?
Unfortunately, that migration data set isn't broken out by age, so I don't have a good answer for that. But in part, that's due to the population that's here, that's staying here, that's not leaving or coming in. Naturally, will get older over time, which is part of it. But, people who are leaving might be people in the workforce that are bringing their kids. And that is definitely could be a factor, but unfortunately, I don't have the data to back that up.
Anyone else have a question?
The average rental, was that a house or an apartment or everything?
That's an apartment. Yep.
Like a one bedroom?
That's the average of all of their surveyed rental units, which, frankly, thinking back to it, could be renting a house, but it's just anything that's on that rental market that you're not an owner. You're either renting out a house or you're renting out a one-bedroom. It captures everything in between. But that's the same cases for Alaska as well. So that 1,300, let's say it was around that number, includes the average of all of the rental units that they're surveying.
Was the search Lego houses factored into this?
Oh, I don't know. They don't publish which units they surveyed, and they don't even publish like a N value, which is the number of units they surveyed. So I don't have which ones they did, I don't know how many they did, and they don't really publish margin of error either, unfortunately, which would be a great thing to dig into if we did have like a primary research project for that. But based on data that's available, I don't have that information.
Any other questions at all? Yeah. You know, we discussed the housing data today quite a bit at lunch, and it is unfortunate that there's not really better data sets out there because it leaves us guessing a lot. But I think all of us have our own anecdotal stories of why our housing market's so tight and what we can do to improve it. But I'm glad that the city, Leading Up, is looking at it because it's a problem. It's driving a lot of the stuff that we're seeing here today. So, any more questions? Oh,
As far as housing goes, do you think that based on current economic data, it is meaning that what's happening in the world related to inflation, changing supply chains, etc., do you think that our housing crunch here in quotes in Sitka is wisely pursued if you look at what the potential future is in relation to outmigration and so forth? What is, with this data, what should be our driver here?
Well, I think there are a number of drivers, but housing is certainly one of them. Housing is certainly a driver throughout the state, and a driver of outmigration throughout the state. And I don't have the magic solution of, what that would entail in order to get that affordable housing in place, but it really is a big factor in people leaving. It's a big factor in the fact that people can't come here and work because they don't have a place to stay. And even though the population is declining, you're still in need for more housing. And that's the same story throughout the state. Everywhere needs more housing. Yes?
At McKinley, do you do any forecasting?
We do forecasting, yes. I do a couple forecasts. One of them is including the AGC's construction forecast, which from that construction forecast, I know that Sturgis Hospital is going to be completed here in 2025. There's going to be another big influx of need for housing based on those employees. Yeah, we do a lot of forecasts. We do some employment forecasting for Anchorage Economic Development Corporation, and we do a lot of forecasting projects, yes. Yeah.
What I'd say, which is interesting, is that I've been in this position for about 15 years, and way back when, the forecast was that we were going to get above 32% for our age of 65 and older, and right on the mark. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I was late. I did not see. Did you have any land projections for raw land available to build on communities?
No, I'm sorry.
That I think is one of our major issues. We do not have available land to build housing on.
Right. Yeah, and that can be the case in a lot of smaller communities where there's just not the developable land available for housing, which is another reason why this housing piece is kind of a big question mark and why there's no silver bullet.
Anybody else have any questions? Oh, over here.
How about the age of the existing housing? And most of, I think, what was built here was in the 60s when the pulp mill surge came in, and all that's 60 years old now. So it looks to me like housing should be looking at infill, where there's existing utilities, roads and water and that kind of stuff. because a lot of these houses will be rebuilt, I would think, in a while.
And maybe currently are. Maybe that's part of the high vacancy rate is people that are currently renovating their houses and can't be there. But just a theory.
Any other questions? Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. You know, the CETA board and myself as the executive director, these are all very important topics to us. We're constantly digging in and trying to figure out solutions to help make our community more livable and therefore getting us a better quality of life for everyone here. So thank you for coming. And like I said, there's a sign-up sheet in the back that we do our own quarterly trends where you can get some of this economic data, maybe not as in depth as Taylor presented today, but it can get you guys like basically where the flows are going. So thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of your sunny day, and I appreciate everyone for being here.
Hey, Kevin. Hey, see you later. Nice to see you.
Hey, Kevin. I just was thinking.
You're watching Sitka Community TV. Be sure to like and subscribe if you like what you see.